Welcome to 10th grade U.S. History. Here we are getting started with our content. So this is Chapter 1, Three Worlds Meet, Section 1, Peopling the Americas. So in this section, obviously in this chapter, we're going to be talking about the convergence of cultures, the convergence of American, both North and South American cultures, European cultures, Asia and Africa coming all together on the North American and South American and Central American continents in the late 1400s, early 1500s. And this is truly a meeting of worlds, and it comes with a lot of terrible things and a lot of positive things too, and things that are certainly going to shape the history of the future United States. Now, obviously, this is U.S. history, and so you may be wondering, why are we talking about Europeans and all this kind of stuff? Well, of course, all of those cultures and all of those backgrounds and all of those different kinds of people influence what eventually becomes the United States. When we talk about U.S. history, that doesn't start with the American Revolution. That doesn't start with the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution or any of those things. It goes way, way, way back. So we have to start with what was here prior to the arrival of Europeans? What made Europeans want to come to what they would eventually call the New World? What was that interaction like? How did Europeans come to settle in the Americas? And what were those settlements like? And what was it that contributed to them eventually becoming an independent nation and all of those things? So today, in this particular section, we are going way, 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 way back. And we're really doing a lot of things and a lot of groups really quite an injustice in trying to condense millions of years of history, much of which we don't even really know a whole lot about, into a very, very small amount of time here. So keep in mind as we go through this that this is very much just looking at really just one in particular, Native American civilization. There were hundreds, there were thousands. We will never really know exactly how many Native American cultures were present before the arrival of Europeans, or even at the time of the arrival of Europeans in the late 1400s. So we are just kind of getting a little bit of a sample here, keep that in mind, but we will talk about a few of these cultures and how they interacted with European cultures once they arrive. Now, on a side note, very, very quickly, if you're in the classroom, I'd be teaching at this point kind of about the note-taking process. It's kind of like an outline, and so I'm going to be putting up basically the bullet points for that outline, and you would need to be taking notes along by filling in some of the details. That's a little bit different in this video format than it might be in person, so ask questions later on if you have them about what kind of note-taking needs to look like, because I'm just going to plow on through here. I'm not going to be stopping and pausing and repeating things a whole lot, so please feel free, and in fact I encourage you to pause the video and all of that when you need to write something down or hear it again or something like that. But from this point, I'm just going to go on through and again ask questions about the note-taking strategy in person or email or something like that. All right, so like I said, we are going to go way, way, way back. Thousands, millions even of years into parts of history that can be a little bit sketchy, where we don't have exact answers about exactly what happened, and certainly not when it happened and all of that. So we want to talk just a little bit about the very first Americans, how we at least think most of them arrived, and a little bit about what some of those people and some of those early American cultures. So the going theory, and the theory that I bet a lot of you are already kind of familiar with, that you've heard of before, the going theory, at least the most widely accepted theory amongst a lot of scientists and historians, is that the first Americans probably arrived here via a land bridge, that they came across a bridge made of ice, which the proper name for it, many of you have probably heard before, known as the Bering Strait. That this was back thousands and thousands of years ago when the Earth was a whole lot colder, and that there actually would have been a bridge of ice. Here, this is Siberia. That is showing you the easternmost portion of Asia, and this would be the westernmost portion of what's now the United States, North America. This would today be Alaska, and then all of this that you see here in this kind of gold color was ice at one point that was frozen over. And so people were able to slowly but surely over time migrate across that land bridge. And there, of course, is tons of debate about exactly when that was happening. We know that was certainly not an overnight overnight thing. We think it may have been somewhere between 12,000 to 15,000 years ago, but evidence is, I'll be looked at all the time. Some newer evidence suggesting it may have actually been much earlier than that. But we know that that would have taken place over, hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years, people slowly but surely migrating across that land bridge, and then migrating and trickling down into North America, into South America, and so forth, and eventually establishing more complex civilizations. Now, a little bit about these people, which also explains why they were traveling somewhere, is we can assume that most of these people, or all of them, were what we call nomads, and that's probably a familiar word to most of you. Nomad, of course, meaning someone who moves from place to place or who wanders. These are people that don't stay in any one place for any long period of time. Certainly not enough to put down roots, as we might say. They are moving from place to place because they are moving because they're following their food. These are what you would call hunter-gatherer societies. They are nomadic because they are following the large game, the large animals that they hunt for food and for supplies, for weapons and all those kinds of things. They are, following the naturally growing edible crops, plants, and so forth, and they're going where that goes. So when the herds move on, they're going to move on. When the climate changes or the seasons change, they're going to move on to find that food. So that's why they are moving around, and that's why they would have eventually migrated across and down these continents. So if they are nomadic, they're hunting and gathering their food, they're not staying in any one place long enough to really start developing large, complex societies with more complex features to them. And also you'll notice that if they are hunting and gathering their food, they're not farming it. So farming, agriculture, that is the big game changer. So farming and agriculture, sometimes I think we tend to think of that as being something that is super common and maybe even boring, and we assume that it's something that has been going on, forever and ever, and certainly it has. But when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, and you look at it in a relative sense, the amount of time that scientists, anthropologists, and others believe that humans have been in existence, that we've been walking on this planet, compared to the amount of time that we've been farming for that existence, the amount of time that we have been farming is just a teeny bit. It is just a blip of human existence that has been going on. So this is a massive change, and when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, a relatively recent one. So the game changer here that changes all of this is what we call the agricultural revolution. And the agricultural revolution, as you can probably guess from its name, agriculture, of course, meaning farming, being revolutionized, it simply refers to the beginning of farming. It refers to humans learning how and beginning to cultivate techniques to grow their own food. And it doesn't start in the Americas. Most evidence suggests that this actually began in the Middle East, sometime maybe 9 to 10,000 years ago. Again, it's debatable as to exactly when. And then eventually that technology and that knowledge spread across the world. And that somewhere, again, 9 to 10,000 years ago, somewhere in there, people in the Americas began to farm. But this is the game changer, and not just because, people have another way to get food. If they can grow their own food, that means that they can settle down. They can cease that nomadic way of life. They can stay in one place. And when they can stay in one place, that means that much more complex society can develop. That means that they can start building more elaborate buildings. They can start growing bigger societies with bigger populations. And so small groups of families are going to evolve into small villages, and then into a network of villages, and then even into large cities, and then into massive empires in some cases that are going to span hundreds and hundreds of miles, with sometimes millions of people in them all over all of these continents. So the agricultural revolution, as well as the technology that comes with it, the tools that had to be developed, the techniques that had to be developed, all of that is a huge game changer, not just in the Americas, but just human existence period, because it means that more complex societies are going to develop. So we know that complex societies eventually start to develop in the Americas. Again, there are lots of different ideas and debates about exactly when that starts to happen. Probably somewhere between about 2000 and maybe 1500 years BC is where we have evidence that more complex societies started to develop in the Americas. And in the Americas, the place where we think complex societies started to develop first, and where some of the most complex and most developed Native American societies formed was in Central America, or what we might call Mesoamerica, what would today be places like Mexico and Guatemala, places like that. There are numerous, civilizations. Like I said, we kind of do these people an injustice right here by not talking about all the ones we know about, but we don't have time for it. And there are also, we need to remember, so many cultures that we know nothing about because they were long gone by the time that Europeans arrived. And so we just need to remember that there were millions of Native Americans, perhaps even 10 million or so just in North America alone. So it's very difficult to say exactly how many were here and all about them. So we're just going to look at really one, kind of as an example, although they are an exception and not the rule. Most Native American societies were not as large or powerful or as wealthy as this particular one was. And that is the Aztecs. I'm getting onto the Aztecs here that some of you may have heard of. Prior to the Aztecs, there were other complex civilizations that developed. In the past, I used to spend a little bit of time talking about the Mayans and their complex culture, which was way before the arrival of Europeans, and how they had not only complex cities and temples and palaces and hospitals and schools, they also had written language. That really made them unique because most Native Americans didn't. And at the time that the Mayans had developed written language, they were one of very few societies on Earth that had done that early. So they're really interesting. A great research topic if you're interested in that kind of thing. And it's also one of those mystery things. We don't really know why their civilization declined. But getting off subject, let me talk about the Aztecs a little bit. And one of the reasons I talk about the Aztecs is, one, they are a good example of how just because something is ancient doesn't mean that it's primitive. A good example of how Native American culture could be incredibly sophisticated. We know that when Europeans arrived, their opinion of most Native Americans was that they were backwards, they were savage, they had no culture, they needed to be civilized. That will certainly be the case with the Aztecs. But we want to make sure that we respect Native American accomplishments and culture. And the Aztecs are definitely a great example of that, of people who had accomplished things as great or greater than Europeans had before they had, and without their help. So I think that's a good, one of a couple reasons to talk about them. That and their interaction with the Spanish is going to be important for us as well. So the Aztecs developed in Central America and what would today be parts of Mexico. And this became a hugely complex and hugely powerful society. This civilization became a mighty empire, and the Aztecs began to exert their control over other civilizations, over other small villages. They are, you think back to, world history, the Roman Empire, you acquire an empire by taking over other people and ruling over them. That's what the Aztecs did to lots of different people throughout Central America. And it's so very powerful militarily, incredibly wealthy, huge cities with palaces, with gold, with copper and other precious metals and stones and things like that, artwork, very complex social structure, religion, mythology, just incredibly complex and advanced kind of a civilization. It included this city, Tenochtitlan, that is pronounced Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was the capital of the Aztec Empire. This was a massive city built out over the water. If you look at, I think I've got a picture of it a little bit later, I'll show you. Where they kind of built it up out. It's surrounded by water. There's canals running through it. There are agricultural areas. They've got irrigation systems. Again, roads, palaces, temples. Like I said, a very complex society. Tenochtitlan, at the time when Europeans arrived, because the Aztecs would be there when the Europeans arrived, the Spanish specifically in 1519. The Aztecs, or the Tenochtitlan, was larger than any European city. So this was larger and had more people living in it than London, than Paris, than Milan, than any of those places. They would have looked like little backwoods towns compared to all of this. So again, an example of how, although Europeans are going to, write off most Native American culture and assume their own superiority over it, it was certainly something that they were probably quite impressed by and quite dazzled by, really. And unfortunately for the Aztecs, their wealth and their riches and those kind of things were certainly things that the Spanish in particular wanted to get their hands on. And so we'll see the Aztecs again a little bit later in this chapter, another one of the reasons I want to talk about them here. because they will be one of the groups that the Spanish will encounter, and the Spanish will eventually destroy the Aztec Empire and take over it and destroy Tenochtitlan and build their own, European-style city over it. So we will get back to them. There may have been as many as maybe as many as 5 million people living in Tenochtitlan when the Spanish arrived. As far as North American cultures, we're not going to look at any here. There are certainly, because there's so many, and so many that we even don't know about, that we're not going to look at here. But just to kind of give you a little bit of just basic information, because it is so complex and so diverse, there were several distinctive North American, Native American civilizations, none of them as large or as powerful or as fully developed as the Aztecs. But there were several. They often warred with each other, but there were complex trade networks. There were thousands and thousands of languages being spoken, some common threads among them, such as a communal living, a sacredness of nature, those kind of things, nature-centered religion, that sort of stuff. But lots of different groups, including, even right here where we are, Creeks and Chickasaws and all of those. And we'll be talking about some more of those throughout the year. So again, keeping in mind that just because Native American societies were very different, that certainly didn't mean that they were not intelligent, they were not civilized. We know that they were. And we also need to remember that we really have hardly too much of an understanding at all about Native American cultures, because there's so much that we don't know. Since these are people that, for the most part, did not possess written language, there was no written record. There's no written record of what came before them. There are entire civilizations, perhaps very complex ones, that disappeared prior to the arrival of Europeans for whatever reason, and we don't know anything about them. There's people that, there could have been much more, civilizations as complex as the Aztecs that we don't know about. So we just need to keep those kind of things in mind and just remember that there are so many voices when it comes to Native American culture. There's so many voices that we don't get to hear, and there's so many pieces of the puzzle that we don't have. And when we talk about the conquest of the Americas, we really don't get too much. We really don't get enough of the Native American side of it because of that. So just something to keep in mind. And what we'll be looking at next is about Europeans and about what leads them to want to come to what they would see as the New World, and then what about that interaction and how that interaction takes place.